We are talking about simplifying expressions with decimals in this video. A couple of things to review in terms of vocabulary is the word expression, which is basically a combination of terms that don't have an equal sign. So all you can do with simplify is combine things as much as possible. We're also dealing with order of operations because those are the rules of math, right? And so all problems utilize order of operations at some point in the process. And then, because it's decimals, we need to double check if there's a description of what place we round our answers. So don't forget that. It's like dealing with fractions, where usually the instructions say fully reduce, fully simplify. However, with fractions, you basically always fully reduce your answers. Okay, but decimals need to be specified in terms of where to round. So in this case, it says simplify, round answers to the nearest 10th place. I'm going to just underline that to hopefully help me remember that that's what I need to do. The other thing that I always do is write my GEMDAS, because again, GEMDAS is a map and I need to look at my map before I go somewhere. Otherwise, it's a very good probability that I will get lost. So looking at number 1, order of operations, right? Grouping is the first thing I need to do. Parentheses, absolute value, brackets, right? And here I see parentheses. So that is where I have to start. When I add what's inside the parentheses, I get 5.6. So I'm going to write what I haven't dealt with yet, which is that -4. The parentheses are still there because all I've done is combine what's on the inside, and I get 5 6/10. Now I look back at GEMDAS. Exponents, well, I don't have exponents, so I move to multiplication and division. A reminder, if I had more than one multiplication and division remaining, I would go left to right. In this case, I just have one multiplication, so it doesn't apply. But that's such an important reminder because as we're learning order of operations, that left to right part is one of the most frequently missed parts of GEMDAS. So, all right, I went ahead and I did my multiplication. A negative times a positive is a negative, so I'm going to go ahead and place the sign of my answer. And then I get 22 4/10. Now going back to where I need to round, it's the 10th place. Well, I have the 10th place right there, so there's nothing I need to do. So that is my final answer. All right, let's go look at B. So same thing with 1B. I'm actually going to erase the arrows that I used to indicate where I was within GEMDAS because I need to do it again. So I start at grouping. I do have parentheses, right? So I need to combine those first. So I get 2 7/10 minus 3 9/10, and I get 5 6/10 times, well, my negative, I have more negatives than I do positives, right? Because 3.9 or 3 9/10 is bigger than 2 7/10. So I have more negative units. So that means my answer is negative. And then when I do that subtraction, I get 1 2/10. This time, I have a negative and positive, although note that the negative is from the calculation in the parentheses rather than being a negative we're multiplying everything by to start. So, you can get that combination of signs multiple ways. Just make sure when you're multiplying or dividing, you remember that a positive times a negative or negative times a positive gives you that negative. So I'm going to place my negative. And now I multiply by -1 2/10, and I get 6 72/100. Before I know my final answer, I need to double check that I've rounded it to the requested place. which is the 10th place. 7 is in the 10th place, right? The first place to the right of the decimal. I look to the right of that. I have a 2, which in this case, because it's 4 or lower, the 7, the number in the 10th place, stays the same. So my final answer is -6 7/10. One way to check your answer, I talked in an earlier video about making sure that you only have a value in the place that you're rounding to. So in this case, since it's the 10th place, my value, my number ends in the 10th place, right? So make sure to use that as a double check. That's super helpful. Moving to 1C, once again, we're returning to our order of operations. I'm going to erase my arrow. And then I'm going to start using that as my map. Now I wanted to mention something because I've done it both in A and also in B. And that is, I figure out the sign of my answer first, and then I run the calculation. So up here, for example, right, when I did that multiplication, I figured out a positive times a negative is a negative. I placed that negative, and then I ran my calculation. I find that to be really, really helpful, especially as expressions get bigger, longer, more complex, and you're dealing with more positives and negatives. So you'll see me do that pretty regularly, and I would encourage you, if you have any challenges with positives and negatives, right when signs flip, all that kind of stuff, that is a process that can be really helpful. So going back to my map, and what I'd actually like you to do is pause the video, go ahead and at least try C, and then watch me go do it. D and E each of these are getting more complex, but just like what we've kept in mind previously, every section is only introducing a small thing. It may feel like, oh, I'm learning another thing. How many rules are there in math? There's so many rules. But here, we're using order of operations, which we've done in multiple other contexts. In this case, it's with decimals. So that is the only difference, right? And so I'd love to have you try D and E, thinking in terms of, okay, yeah, it's decimals, but it's order of operations. That will allow you to really review and see how you're doing with order of operations as a process. All right, so pause the video, give them a try, and then go ahead and turn it back on. All right, so order of operations. I'm going to go over to my GEMDAS that I wrote on the right-hand side of the page. I'm going to look at my grouping, and then I go back here and I see, yep, I have grouping. So that is the very first thing I need to do. I will write what is going to be unchanged at this point, and then I will do that addition that it is inside the parentheses. So 10 and 42 hundredths plus 2 and 8 tenths is 13 and 22 hundredths. I'm going to make 2 comments. One is, when your final answer needs to be rounded, you only round at the end. And really, anytime you're doing math problems, you only round at the end. So yes, that's 13 and 22 hundredths, but we don't want to drop the 100th place. The reason for that is because every decimal place that we round out of, we lose accuracy in our answer. Now at this point, it doesn't make a huge difference in the answer. Once we're really working with exponents and things like that, those changes make huge differences. Okay, so make sure that you're only rounding at the very end. Now the other thing I want to mention, and we've actually had it in each of the problems in this section, notice right here, we have something sitting right next to the parenthesis. That means we have multiplication. So between the step of doing our grouping and rewriting it, make sure that you still have something sitting right next to a parenthesis. If there's no addition sign or subtraction sign between that negative 2.1 and the parenthesis at the beginning, there won't be an addition or subtraction sign between it at any point as we move forward. Some people end up putting those signs in there because once those parentheses are dealt with, there's confusion as to what happens. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If there isn't addition or subtraction between something and parentheses at the beginning, there won't be throughout the process as you simplify. Now, I'm done with my grouping. Right now, the parentheses are indicating multiplication. Now, I don't have exponents, but as I just pointed out there, I do have multiplication. That is the next thing that I will do. So I'm going to rewrite the part that I'm not using, right? That's waiting because I haven't gotten to that part of order of operations yet. And then I'm going to apply my multiplication. This negative right here travels with the 2.1 or the 2/10. So that means when I multiply, I am multiplying by negative 2.1. If I'm multiplying a negative times a positive, that means I have a negative. So as in the previous problems, I'm going to place my negative first, and then I run my calculation and do 2 1/10 times 13 22/100, and I get 27 762 thousandths. Okay, that fact that the negative in front of the 2.1 is the same as multiplying by a negative 2.1 is really important. And let me show you why that negative is included when you're multiplying by the 2.1. So just with a different color here, I am going to write the 7 6/10 minus the 2.1. Okay, and then we have, so I'm just rewriting the whole thing. But what I care about is that right there. Subtraction is the same as adding a negative. When we've talked about number lines, we've talked about that the signs are directional. So if you have a positive number, you go to the right of 0. If you have a negative number, you go to the left. It doesn't matter whether the subtraction is written as minus something, or in this case, I could rewrite this as plus negative 2.1, and then again the 13, right, and 22/100. This means exactly the same thing because, again, all it's saying is that negative is sending us to the left. If it's confusing as to whether you include the negative in the number, first of all, you always include the negative when it's in front. But if you forget that regularly, I would always rewrite subtraction as plus a negative. Then I think it's easier to see that, oh yeah, I am actually multiplying by a negative 2.1. So I highly encourage you to play with that a little bit and decide what works best for you. At this point, all we have left is our addition and subtraction, which is the last step for order of operations. Looking at this, I have more negatives than I do positives, so I already know my answer is going to be negative. So I am going to do my 7 6/10 minus 27 762 thousandths. Okay, so that gives me 162 thousandths. So negative 20 and 162 thousandths. That is not my final answer because those are places that shouldn't be in my answer because I'm supposed to round to the 10th. The 1 is in the 10th place. Now I look 1 to the right and I see that it's greater than 5. So that means the 1 goes up. So my final answer is negative 20 and 2/10. When you state the answer, whenever you state a decimal, you should be stating the place that you've been asked to round to. So notice in this case, we're asked to round to the 10th place. And when I name this number, I get negative 20 and 2/10. It's another way to confirm that you've likely done something correctly. So making sure that you know the naming conventions of these can be really helpful as a double check for your rounding. All right, if you haven't done D yet, go ahead and pause the video and try it, and then I will take you through it. So looking at this, we once again have GEMDAS. We are simplifying. Again, we're simplifying with decimals, but the simplifying is still the same process. Looking at D, I do have grouping right here. So that's where I'm going to start. I don't make any other changes. I only do, each line of my work is dealing with one step of order of operations. So if I had more than one grouping symbol, I would be combining or simplifying all of those grouping symbols. Then I would move to the next step. If I had multiple exponents, I would simplify all of those and so forth. For me, it helps me stay organized, both as I'm doing the problem, and then also if I've made a mistake, it helps me track down what that mistake, where that mistake was and what the mistake was. So now I have 13 and 45 hundredths minus 15 and 75 hundredths. I notice that I have more negatives than I do positives. So I know that my answer has to be negative. I run the subtraction and I get 2 and 3/10. I don't have any other grouping symbols or grouping. I do have the symbols, right? I do have the parentheses, but there's nothing to combine in the parentheses. They're already fully reduced. So I'm ready to move to the next part of GEMDAS. So I'm done with exponents. Now I've moved to multiplication and division, which I have right here. Now I'm going to rewrite. Oh, haha, look what I did. That's funny, but this is why you use your map. I just caught myself, right? I ended up skipping right over my exponents because I was so focused on that grouping. Okay, so that's okay. I caught it. Let's go back. And so one thing about when I'm teaching, when I'm making videos, it's really important to me that people see that everybody makes mistakes, right? Mistakes are part of learning. So I could go back and I could fix the video, but I want you to recognize that mistakes are made. How do you catch the mistakes and how do you correct them? Mistakes are the best way to learn. In fact, I have a plaque at home and it says, there are no such things as mistakes, only lessons. So we need to and will have mistakes as we're learning. And that was an example, right? I was just rushing. I got too stuck on that one part of the expression. So now I'm going to go back and actually do my exponents, not just mark it as done. Now, remember, the first step that you have to do when simplifying exponents is identify the base. So I need to look at that negative 3 and 2/10 squared and figure out what is it that I'm squaring. There are no parentheses, so that negative is not included in the base. Just as a reminder, that means that I can rewrite that as negative 1 times 3.2 squared. So it's the 3.2 that I am multiplying, and that negative 1 is not part of the base. So a quick review on exponents. These negatives are the trickiest part of exponents. I know I struggled with them as I was learning, and I do see a struggle with a lot of my students. I'm going to go ahead and run that calculation. So let's see. I've got 3 2/10 squared, and that gives me the negative, because it's -1 times whatever I get down here. Well, I got 10 24/100. -1 times a positive number is negative. All right, and then 10 24/100. Now I'm going to write everything that's remaining, because again, I just do one order of operations step before I do anything else. Now I'm done with exponents, and I'm going to go ahead and go to my multiplication and division, which is right here. I'm going to write what I'm not touching at this step. I notice that I have a negative times a positive, which means my answer will be negative. Then I multiply my 5 2/10 times 2 3/10, and that gives me 11 96/100. I don't see any other multiplication or division, so now I move to addition and subtraction. When I look at signs, what I'm adding and subtracting, if the signs are the same, so in this case, both numbers are negative, that means I have two numbers that are sending me to the left. So whether my numbers are both positive or both negative, I'm again going to figure out what the sign of my answer is. So since they're both negative, I know that my answer has to be negative. And then I can just add those numbers. I don't even have to incorporate that negative. So here I put my negative because I already know the answer to my sign. And now I'm just adding 10 24/100 plus 11 96/100. And that gives me 22 2/10. I need to round to the 10th place. It's already at the 10th place. So that is my final answer. All right, E. Same thing. Look at your order of operations, which I'm actually going to rewrite because I can't see all of it anymore. Okay, JEM-DOS. Now I'm going to use it as my map. So I look for my grouping. In this case, I actually have two grouping symbols. And this is a perfect example of why I use grouping instead of parentheses, because parentheses and absolute value are used at the same time. Well, traditionally, the order of operations, we just talk about parentheses. I want to make sure that you see the parentheses and absolute value at the same level instead of seeing just, oh, parentheses are first, and doing those and then not being sure what to do with absolute value. So great example of why I use G in order of operations and not P for parentheses. First thing I'll do is combine what's inside the first parenthesis. I notice that I have more negatives than I do positives. So I know that my answer inside the parentheses is negative. So I do my 5 86/100 minus 7 83/100. And I get -1 97/100 squared. I haven't done anything with that yet. Minus 2 23/100 absolute value. And on the inside of the absolute value, I see once again, I have more negatives than I do positives. So I know that when simplified within the absolute value, the answer will be negative. But then we have to remember what happens with an absolute value. So absolute value is a little bit different than the parentheses because there are two things that you have to do for absolute value. So at this point, if I had parentheses instead of absolute value, I would be ready to move to the next step, but I'm not. I need to apply the absolute value first before I do anything else, or at least that's what I would recommend. So it's not really a calculation, right? It doesn't fall, this portion doesn't fall within order of operations, other than we want to fully deal with absolute value before we move to the next thing. So we've grouped, we're applying the absolute value, and then we move to the exponents. So don't forget that. Absolute value is telling you how many units a number is from 0. So absolute value is always positive. Also, when I've applied the absolute value, I change the symbols to parentheses, because if I have multiplication, which I do here, I don't want to lose that multiplication. I have to continue having parentheses to show that operation. All right, I'm not dealing with my exponent yet. You could if you wanted to, but I want to reduce the chance of making a mistake on forgetting to apply the absolute value. So that's why I'm doing it in the order that I am. I switched the absolute value to a parenthesis. I turned the value on the inside positive because, again, absolute value is the distance from 0, so they're always positive. Now I go back to my order of operations, and I'm officially done with grouping. Now I'm ready to do exponents. Identify your base. Well, this time the negative is inside the parentheses, so the base is negative 1 97 hundredths. So that is what I'm squaring. That also means because I'm multiplying two negatives together, my answer will be positive. So I get 3, 800, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to mention here, this is about as long as I write all places. I don't want the numbers that I write to get too big. So what you'll sometimes see me do is I will write out and round a number to, say, the 100th place, but I keep all of the places in my calculator. So yes, in other cases, if I had more places than this, you would see me round, but again, my actual calculations don't incorporate that rounding. It just makes following my work far easier. And again, that organization piece, it is very helpful. Now, I am going to write what's remaining. And I'm ready to move to the next part of order of operations, which is multiplication and division. I have that right here. So that's the next thing that I'm going to do. I'll just draw an arrow up here so it's a little easier to follow. Negative times a positive is a negative. So I'm writing that first term. I know that the second term will be negative, so I'm going to place that. And then I do my 2 23 hundredths times 7 39 hundredths. This time I get, and it's continuing to get longer. So I'm going to go ahead and write, you should have gotten 16 and then 4797. So there are 4 places to the right of the decimal. That's what should be on your calculator right now. I'm going to write 48 hundredths, but I'm going to leave all of the decimal places as I am calculating. Here, I again have more negatives than I do positives, so I know my answer will be negative. I'm going to subtract, and I get 12, and then 5, 9, 8, 8. Far more places than I need. I've got to round that to the 10th. Well, the 10th is right here. It's just that first value to the right of the decimal. Now I look one more place. That is 5 or greater, so I know that the 5 has to go up. So I get negative 12 6/10. Notice, once I've identified what happens to the 10th place, all of those values go away. So your number is ending in the place that you are rounding. All right, that's your final answer. Now moving into application problems,